Sometimes, okay, most of the time, I find myself daydreaming. Like, what would it be like if I had $1 million?
If I had $1 million, if I had $1 million.
Okay, so if I had $1 million, I'd buy all my writer friends, or aspiring writer friends, a copy of The Art of Creative Research by Philip Gerard. What a great read, and so valuable, as it doesn't just apply to nonfiction writing, it applies to fiction and poetry on that believable, authentic level. Naturally, it was my great pleasure to speak with Philip about the book, but also about his journey as a writer, and what a journey. He's the author of several books of fiction and nonfiction, including the novels Cape Fear Rising and The Patron Saint of Dreams, nonfiction books like Secret Soldiers and Down the Wild Cape Fear, and books on writing like The Art of Creative Research and Creative Nonfiction, Research and Crafting Stories from Real Life. He also teaches full-time at University of Wilmington, North Carolina, and also in a couple different MFA programs, and he's putting out a music album. So if there's a more interesting man in the world, show me, because I think we corralled him for episode 38. And also, you know the drill. Share this, subscribe on iTunes or Google Play Music, like the hashtag CNF Podcast on Facebook, follow me on Twitter, and let's stay connected and keep encouraging each other. So, without further ado, here's my conversation with Philip Gerard. I oftentimes like to start asking people about is, especially for someone like you who writes so much, writes about writing so much, fiction, nonfiction, teaches a lot. So how do you unplug from that? What are some of your hobbies that you're into that gets you away from a lot of the writing life, that allows you to come back to it fresh?
Well, as I tell my wife, Jill, I don't really have hobbies, but I have passions. And well, one of them, I got a guitar back here. I love music. Yeah. I did my first album last year and toured it this summer. The first thing we did when we moved into the house was build a music room onto it. So I've got basically a music studio with a keyboard and pedal steel and all guitar hangers and what have you. That's it. The dogs are currently locked out of the office because otherwise they would take over the conversation, especially my Australian Shepherd, Daisy Duke. She's my pal. Yep. So we go in the morning and run at the park. And then sailing. Sailing has always been my passion. And now that I'm no longer chair of the department, I did some repairs on the boat this year. I'm hoping to get out and have a nice spring sailing season. So those things, and then I tend to compartmentalize. So when I'm not working, I'm really not working. I mean, I know how to relax. Otherwise, you're just on, and you never get away from it. And there's always one more call to make, one more email to answer, one more note to take. And so like when I'm on, I'm on. But when I'm off duty, the lights go out.
Yeah. How do you make that delineation? Is that something that's very concrete for you? Or like these are the weeks or months out of the year that the switch goes off? Or is it more fluid than that?
It's really project driven. So now in addition to the Civil War book that I told you about I'm also doing a new edition of Creative Nonfiction. So I've been editing that, and I'm in the process of turning music into a kind of a memoir. I did a magazine piece on the making of the album American Anthem last year, and that was sort of the intro to, because it started with a list that I made when I was a kid. I put down 10 things I expected to achieve in my life, and one of them, writing a book, falling in love, going to Alaska, the usual stuff. And the last one on the list was making an album, because I was just so I thought that would be a dream. And in the old days, you couldn't do that. You'd have to get with Atlantic Records or somebody, and they'd have to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in you. Nowadays, though, I found a local producer in town, does great albums, fully professional, full studio and the whole thing. And, I'm a member of ASCAP now. We're selling stuff online, downloads. I'm doing concerts. And so I'm writing about that as the kind of culmination of a life in music that started when I was, just 12 or 13 years old.
Wow. And how is picking up and becoming proficient with the guitar and I assume singing too? Do you sing?
Oh yeah.
With that, so
I do my best.
yeah. How has that informed your creativity? At this stage in your writing career?
It's really going into the studio was a great process because it was like the graduate course in music. It was taking 15 songs completely apart, rewriting sections of them, writing bridges for them, doing new instrumentation, changing keys, changing tempo, and then teaching other people some of the parts because, I had to have bass players and drummers and other keyboard players, and I did a lot of the instruments, but breaking it all down, putting it back together again in a really intense way. And in a place where, if you're doing a live performance, kind of like doing a reading, if you make a mistake, if you bumble something, it gets lost in the ambience of the moment. And if people are having a good time, who cares? If you crab a note into a microphone in a studio, it's a crab note and it doesn't go away. If you're off key, you're off key and it doesn't go away. So what you really wind up doing is concentrating in a really intensive way. And I found it very much like kind of going into the zone when I'm writing, where if I'm really into the zone and there's a knock on the door because, Jill needs something, it's like being really literally being woken out of that dream that John Gardner used to talk about. And so that's what the studio was like. And I would come out of it both completely exhausted after maybe a 2 or 3 hour session, but also completely refreshed in a way like that I expect people get from meditation, maybe. So the analog for the creative process has been several things. One is working with a producer was very much like working with a great editor who's constantly kind of coaxing more out of you, constantly helping you to find the truth in a line of your verse of your song when you were kind of falling for a lazy rhyme, because you hear on the radio a million times and he's pushing you, no, that's not quite, we don't have it quite there. Or you put in vocals and then decide, no, that sounds too flowery. Take it out again. We don't need that harmony. And it's very much like a good editor who's really trying to bring out the best in your work on your own terms rather than, imposing their will on you. But the other thing was the intensity of the process was there's just no cheating. I said in the studio before, and this guy is old school. Jeff Reed, my producer, is old school. He's like, we're going to have good mics. And that's it. We're not going to put in all kind of fancy, what he calls magic dust, these effects. We're going to do it. We'll put a little reverb in your headphones so it sounds live because, of course, the studio is an anechoic chamber and it doesn't sound natural. All the sound just sort of dies. But you get the truth, and it's very much like looking at a first draft and saying, okay, I'm not going to look for what I intended to be here. I'm not going to look for what I hope is here. I'm not going to look for stuff that strokes my ego. I'm going to look at what I actually wrote and how good it is and be as brutally honest as I can be. And so I think it's a great thing. And in fact, I'm putting together a songwriting class for the MFA program here at Wilmington just because I think it was so valuable to me. And the other thing I do with my music, I take a very large project like the Civil War project, for example, and I try to distill it down into a song or a couple of songs that really get at the thematic spirit of what I'm trying to do and kind of capture the DNA of the project. And of course, in songwriting, you're really limited. I mean, you've got a few bars, you've got 2 or 3 minutes, and you kind of have to do it all. And so you really get back to what's essential. You really do sort of find that essential mother lode of what you're really into. And then you can kind of relax out of that when you go back into prose and you're writing an essay or a novel or whatever, and you can take it in all the directions you want to. But until you really get what it is at the essence, you're not going to be able to do that. So I think that things are extremely go hand in hand and are extremely useful back and forth.
Yeah, that's an incredibly neat way that they can piggyback off one another. In a lot of ways, the process is the same, but it's exercising a different muscle. So you're coming at both works fresh, even though you're sort of working out a very similar, congruent creative muscle, but you're not fatiguing your mind in a way that you might be if you were just solely dedicated to prose or solely dedicated to music.
Yeah, I think that's really key. And I tell all my writing students, get out of your own head once in a while and do something. It's why a lot of writers paint, not because they're great painters, because most of them are terrible painters, but it does give them something that they have to do with their eye and their hand and not especially their mind. They just have to look and pay attention and then try to create something out of that. And it's a very different set of muscles, as you say. But you come back from it refreshed, and it's really, you get kind of a bank shot, it comes back into your own work in ways you don't expect. But it really is refreshing. The other thing is nobody expects me to be any good as a musician. It's kind of like a fish riding a bicycle. Pick up a guitar and walk out on the stage like, whoa. Roy Jr. one time I performed with him up in a concert we did with the woman who had produced the Rock Bottom Remainders. And we were doing the rehearsal, and he said, "Oh my God, a writer who can sing. What's that all about?" So the thing is, you don't have to be great at it. You can really just be an enthusiastic amateur, and it works. And so the pressure is often away, and it leads to you able to make all the discoveries that come with messing something up, with failing at something until you get it right. And that's a great lesson for a writer.
You talked about reaching a sense of flow and a kind of that you go into the cave and you come out tired, but you also come out refreshed. And how do you sort of nurture that and get into that flow state, whether it be writing or music? And how do you cultivate that feeling and ride that wave when you're able to get there?
Well, for me, it starts with defining a place. So in every house I've lived in since I was a graduate student, I defined a space for writing. And at one point, it was the kitchen table. At one point, it was a little desk in my bedroom. I now, for the last many years, have had we always buy a house that has an extra room to turn into a study. I built one at my last house. The same with the music room. So I come in here, I close the door, the books are all around me. My research stuff is here, the computer's here, typewriter, whatever I need. And so I'm here for one reason, and I've got the habit now that my body and mind kind of know that's what I'm doing here. So when I'm in here, I don't grade papers. I don't do lots of social media or anything. I'll check in with friends once in a while, but mainly when I'm here to get into the zone and to write. And so I typically, I do a lot of planning in my life, just because when your life gets busier, if you just let things sort of happen, everything will hijack your time away from you. And so I put things on my calendar. I'm writing for these hours, and if it doesn't go well, it doesn't go well. But if I do this enough days in a row, probably I'm going to get there. And if I've got particular projects, like I'm revising something, I pretty much set out, here's the chunk I'm doing today, here's the chunk I'm doing tomorrow. And so I kind of know I don't have to do all that today. I'm doing this part of it. And so the pressure is often away. I've got a limited world to work with, and I can just dive into it and get lost and do whatever it takes. And it might be a question sometimes of taking one paragraph apart or one scene apart and putting it back together, or doing one bit of research on one fact that has been really elusive to find. And so you're on the phone, you're on the internet, what have you. But at the end of the day, you say, okay, I got that work done, check that off the list, and now I can go have a beer, play with my dog, whatever you want to do. And so I find that planning kind of makes a difference, because life is going to interrupt. Yesterday my wife's car broke down, so I left my writing desk to go find her and pick her up and get her car towed. And but I'll get that time back. I'll say, well, okay, I lost 2 hours, but I'll buy it back over here. And so I'm always constantly making these sort of strange psychological deals with myself. But closing the door, the only person allowed in the writing room with me is my dog, Daisy Duke. She's at the desk about every half hour, 45 minutes. She'll get up and put her head on my leg, like, come on, it's time to go out. I have the door that goes out onto the deck here. She'd go out in the backyard, and we can go take a walk around, look at the pond or whatever. The back marsh here. So it's a matter of, kind of, there are habits that we have that kind of psych us into what we're supposed to be doing. Even when I'm on stage, I've got a little rug, and it's my stage. So if I set that up in somebody's living room or on a concert stage, I've got this little 5x8 rug. That's my performance space. If I might have 20 musicians around me, I might have just myself and my guitar, but that's my stage, wherever it is. And so when I unroll it, we're playing. And that's what it's there for. So there are little tricks that you do, and just ways you create a habit, and then you can go in and just relax into the work.
And I wonder, when you were a kid, like 8 years old or so, like, what did you want to be when you grew up?
That's a good question, because I think back on it. I didn't want to be what my dad was, and I wasn't sure what my dad was. All I know is he would put on a suit in the morning. He would either drive in or go to the stop to get picked up by the carpool, go into an office for the DuPont company, where he worked for, I think, about 46 years. And it was a great job, great benefits and the whole thing, but I never quite understood what he did. And I went to work with him a number of times. At one point, I remember he was working with IBM computers back in the day when they were the size of this room, essentially. And he actually took me inside the old Univac computer they were decommissioning. But I knew I didn't want to just do that kind of office work. I thought, I didn't, there was nothing real about any profession in those days. I think I just thought I wanted to have a kind of an adventure in my life, and I wasn't sure what form that would take. In college, I played a lot of music, and I thought, well, gee, the thing to do would be to kind of be a session man and get in with the studios. But I wasn't good enough, and I figured that out. I didn't want to be, 50 years old and playing at the Holiday Inn, hoping that I got enough tips to make it through the week. So I kept with the music, but I kept on looking for things, and I started teaching accidentally. I was called into a classroom. I got, on a Friday afternoon, the director of comp at Arizona called me up and said, would you like to teach a couple of sections of freshman comp? We have a TA who quit. And I said, well, when do I have to be there? He goes, Monday morning. I think it was 8 o'clock. So I had basically 48 hours, and I walked into the classroom, and I thought, I kind of belong here. I can do this. And I really like the give and take. I like being in a room where people wanted to talk about writing and wanted to be smart about it. And especially if you're kind of living that solitary writing life where you spend a lot of time all by yourself in a little room, staring at a keyboard and a screen, it's great to then go into a room full of people, smart people that really honor what you do and talk about it and discuss it and argue about it and, all of that. So I kind of got to where I am as a teacher in a very sort of roundabout, accidental way. I figured I would end up being a journalist, which I'd been before I went back to get my MFA. But I've continued to do that as a magazine journalist, but not sort of hardcore daily deadline journalism.
When you walked into that classroom, what was that feeling like when you looked at all those faces looking back at you at 8 a.m. on a Monday morning?
Well, I had gone to a friend of mine who was an older TA who had been teaching before he came to the graduate program. And I said, do you have any advice? And he said, yes. He said 2 things. Before you walk into that classroom, check your fly and know the first thing that's going to come out of your mouth. First thing you're going to say. So I had a plan, and I tended in those days to overplan and mostly abandon my plan about halfway through. But I always knew if things got slow, I had something to fall back on. But what I also realized was when you walk into a classroom, for better or for worse, people assume you belong at the head of the class. You belong at the head of the seminar table or whatever it is. And they don't know, are you a TA, are you tenured, are you not, are you a visitor, are you an instructor? They really don't understand rank, and they shouldn't. They don't have to. But they kind of grant you that initial authority, and it's up to you to keep it. And so I was always of the position that every class was going to be about a lesson, whether it's a workshop or a freshman comp class or whatever. I always had something particular in mind that I wanted to aim toward. And if we got toward other things, great. But I didn't have like 56 things to do. I usually had one thing. I wanted to talk about beginnings or endings, or I wanted to talk about imagery, or I wanted to talk about how you take a dry fact like a statistic from a budget and turn it into an interesting dramatic moment in a piece. Some particular thing, and then all the stuff around that would sort of coalesce almost like crystallizing around it, and you'd have this constellation of things. But at the core would be that, and I still do student manuscript workshops that way, where I've got something very particular I'm after, and I want to get to that, whatever else we do.
How did you not, maybe you did, how did you not maybe get intimidated by the big block of time that you had when you had just, say, one thing of focus? You're like, I'm working on beginnings today, but I've got 60 minutes. That can seem a little bit overwhelming. So, how did you approach that as a young teacher, and then as you've honed that over the years?
Well, it's a good question, and I sort of do it the way I do an interview. When I go to interview someone, I never think of it as a list of questions. I think of it as a conversation. Mm-hmm. I think of it as I'm going to approach somebody who probably up to that moment is a stranger, doesn't know me, I don't know them, and I'm hoping that if we talk long enough, they'll tell me something that I really want to know and that I can really use. And then in talking to me, they will feel some sense of fulfillment that they got to articulate something that's on their mind. So I want it to be a transaction. I don't want to just kind of suck all the knowledge out of their head and then go, thank you very much. Now you've bared your soul. But when I do it, I do in fact have a list of things that if there's usually in an interview one big thing I want to get to. And then there are probably other things that if we have time, I'd like to ding them on that and maybe go off in a different direction. And certainly as they're talking, I'm alert to what it is they're trying to tell me, so that even if I thought the interview was about X, it might turn out to be about Y. And if they say something really interesting, I have to be listening in a way that can help me take the interview in that direction. So I've always got fallback stuff. And I've always been of the opinion when you start an interview, it almost doesn't matter what anybody says. What matters is you start talking, and that you talk in some way that that helps you figure out who each other are. You know, it turns out I've done some research on language, and it turns out scientists have actually studied this. And some very large percentage of human conversation that they study is about absolutely nothing. It's what they call social grooming. It's just people talking about the weather, talking about have a nice day, talking about whatever trivial gossip is going on in their lives. And it's simply a way of saying, we're connected, you're my friend, we're acquaintances, we're neighbors, what have you. And an interview and a class both have that in common, I think. In a class, I would go in and say, okay, I want to get the beginnings. But I also know that they've got some other concerns that are going to come up. And as the conversation goes on, I'm happy to let the conversation roam around a while and go off on certain tangents, and especially if we can provoke questions, because I always want to be addressing what is on their mind and what my students think they need to talk about. But then I'll be circling on back to that first thing, and very often you find out that the way to talk about beginnings is to start with an ending, or the way to talk about character is to talk about the situation that character is in, or to talk about how you make a dry fact out of a budget. You say, well, what exactly is a budget? Let's look at the budget as a dramatic thing that expresses hope and intention and a belief about how the future is going to unfold. And so we back off from it and create a paradigm and a context, and then move to the other question later. So the one question always contains a kind of constellation of other questions and other concerns. And so there's always a few things in your back pocket to get to. And
when you bring up the social grooming and a lot of those conversational things that a lot of kind of like routine type conversations that aren't very interesting on the surface.
Right.
But what we ultimately want to do is get to what's very engaging and interesting and kinetic about somebody's life. So how do you penetrate that social grooming and get to the meat that makes for interesting and gripping narrative?
There are a lot of ways to do it. One way is just to keep talking. I found out long ago as a young, I don't even think they used the word then, but I always felt I was a cub reporter because I went into journalism with no training at all. But I would talk to people, and I found that if I just hung out with them long enough, they would eventually tell me something interesting, often something that they didn't mean to tell me. And not because, it was a big expose, but often because they either didn't think I cared about it, or they'd forgotten about it till the moment when I came up in the conversation, or something triggered it in something else we talked about. So that was one thing. Another thing is, where are you? If you're in a sterile environment, and sometimes you have to, sometimes an airport lounge meeting between planes, that's all you're going to get. But if you can be in someone's home where they have the picture of their family, or a diploma, or a souvenir from some trip, or, whatever it is, every object in everybody's house has its own story, and getting them to tell the story of why that object is on their shelf, or why that painting is on their wall, or where that, Persian carpet came from, or what have you. Those things often lead to really intimate moments, story moments where people are telling you all about themselves. When I interviewed World War II soldiers for my book, Secret Soldiers, one of the last questions I always asked them was, did you bring anything home from the war? And I tried as often as I could. I interviewed them at their home, or in many cases at their studios, because many were artists. And they would all, light up and say, "Oh yeah, I forgot I got this thing up in my closet." And they would go bring home a rifle, or one guy brought down a box of ammunition, German machine gun ammunition. In fact, he gave me a round. Another guy went upstairs, and I heard him clattering around, and he comes flying down the stairs, and he's beaming, and he's dressed in his Class A Army uniform from 1945 when he was mustered out. And he said, "Look, it still fits." And it was delightful. But those moments, you see people as they actually are. I mean, I had so many people after an hour's conversation or spending half a day with them, you would end up with somebody in tears, or with gales of laughter, or with, you've just reached through, and that whatever was artificial between you is gone. And there's lots of hugging and, lots of handshaking, and a real encounter is taking place, one that you both feel good about.
Yeah, even when you get to that point, sometimes you forget that you're still in the process of like trying to craft a story too. So it's almost like you have to remind yourself and remind them that there's still this other thing going on. That you do intend to write about them, whether it be fiction or nonfiction. Nonfiction is the one that can be really bruising if you're not careful. So, like, how do you navigate that? Like, because when you have these conversations, there's an intimacy and a friendship that develops over time, but you're still ultimately, I hate to use the term, but like kind of using them for a story, even though you're getting to a very friendly, intimate level with them.
It is a transaction, and luckily, I guess for me, I'm not in the business of doing expose books or expose pieces where I'm trying to nail somebody for stealing the money or whatever. But it is true that people's private stories are really precious. And so, for example, the World War II soldiers, they were telling me very intimate details about life, not just in the Army, but afterwards. And they were telling me many things that they had never even told their wives. And I had one guy breaking down at a kitchen table at the end of the interview, and he was in tears. And he told me that his last job as a combat engineer after they disbanded the secret unit was to be the bulldozer driver who was pushing bodies into mass graves at concentration camps. And he had never told his wife this. And she came into the room and said, what did you do? What have you done? And she had been hovering all through the interview in the next room, and he had sort of banished her to talk to me privately. And he finally said it's okay, and he was sobbing, but she said, and then he told her what he had just told me, and she said, now I know why he hasn't slept the night through since the war. And they'd been married, I think, 60 years at that point or thereabouts. So you get at these moments like that, and there are things that never make it into a book or a piece. Where I can, I try to run things by somebody to say, especially if I'm not sure that they said a certain thing, or if I'm not sure about a fact, I'll say, here's what I'm doing, and I want it to be accurate. So is this right? And I'll either read it back to them. In some cases, I'll show them copies of it. I'm not a hard news journalist, and so showing the copy of my news story isn't really that taboo. When you're writing a book, you can negotiate that. But I like to think that they know that I'm not doing a hatchet job, and I'm going to be honest and as fair and just as humane as I can be. And that's hard sometimes. One of the things I hate doing is describing people who are still alive. I'm going to read it because almost nobody is ever happy with the way you describe them unless you say, she's beautiful, he's an Adonis, he's a guy, whatever. I was I was writing about a friend of mine one time, and I said he had a Brooklyn accent, and he was upset. He said, I don't have a Brooklyn accent. It's Manhattan, you dope. I didn't know. I had been to New York like one time. And people get upset when you say, oh, they're overweight or they're bald. It's never, they never get upset when you say they stole the money. It's always, my hair's not really thinning.
Yeah, when I was writing about my dad in Tools of Ignorance, like I said, like he had a keg of a torso with ski pole legs. And he's just like, he took issue. He's like, I'll have you know that a lot of people have told me I have great legs. I was like, Dad, I don't. I'm like, that's not the issue here.
Yeah. I'm much more comfortable writing about historical figures because then you can really pull out the stops, and you're going by photographs and descriptions of people that wrote at the time, but they're not going to call you up and get mad.
Yeah. And when you were sort of coming up and developing as a writer, like who did you imitate on your way to finding your own voice?
I remember as a kid in high school, I think I was maybe a sophomore in high school, and I stayed up and watched The Late Show. And The Late Show was a story called The Adventures of a Young Man, and it was based on Hemingway's Nick Adams stories. And Paul Newman actually played the battler, the punch-drunk boxer, and there were lots of other stars in it. And I saw that it was based on those stories. I'd never heard of Hemingway. I walked into the university bookstore in my hometown in Newark, Delaware the next day, bought the Nick Adams stories, went home, read all of them. I thought, holy cow, these are real. And then I went out and pretty much bought every other thing Hemingway had ever written and began to read that. And then I branched off. And I thought, okay, what I can do here is there was clarity and there was a realness. It wasn't like reading Henry James or Silas Marner, all these things we read in high school, which felt like they belonged to England in some bygone era. And then I began. I discovered Joseph Heller. I discovered Ken Kesey, writers like that. And then later on, as there were writers I met at Breadloaf like Tim O'Brien, John Gardner, Ron Hansen. They were all just terrific writers. And so I began looking at a couple of things. One, what they wrote about, and then I began looking at how they crafted sentences. So if you look at a guy like Tim O'Brien, I mean, God, his sentences they're like almost like he's punching at you sometimes. They're beautiful, but there's just such a power there. And I've known Tim now many years, and I see just how relentless he is at revising his work. And when he was bringing out the new edition of the things they carried, he decided that he'd used the word weird too many times. He went back through and edited the whole book again. And this is, 20 years after it came out or what have you. So the lesson that I learned was that this stuff doesn't happen by accident. And Hemingway always talked about, the drafting and taking things out. And of course, he had Ezra Pound looking over his shoulder to help him. But I began realizing that there was a significant amount of work that wasn't on the page, but that if you did it, it would be on the page because of, what Hemingway's thing, the less is more, what you did off the page shows up. And I think that's really true. It's kind of, the analogy, I guess, to sports would be, in those spring training games when all you're doing is fielding one grounder after another, hitting the cutoff men 200 times in a row. The pitcher's practicing the bunt. They're practicing the suicide squeeze from third. And then 5 months later in the playoff game, somebody executes a bunt and it's perfect. That was because they did it 400 times down in Florida before they ever set a foot on a Major League Baseball field. Yeah. I think that's the analogy with writing is the same thing. I learned it from those guys that, if you look at early drafts of S. Scott Fitzgerald or, other writers who are meant to be, you're taught are so elegant and so perfect, you realize how clumsy they were. I pulled, when I was in Chicago, I went to the library and pulled out a bunch of Ernest Hemingway's earliest stories when he was a high school kid. And they read like, Dangerous Dan McGrew. I mean, he jerked his hog leg and it's the other guy thudded to the ground going, oh my God, I've been shot. I mean, I'm not quoting, but that was the kind of stuff it was. It was just the worst kind of men's pulp fiction. And he had written through that and gotten to something else. And that's what I was trying to do, to get past the lurid, get past the purple, to get past all that stuff that you have to do while you're learning. And get to the thing that's clean and powerful and that actually says exactly what you're trying to say.
Yeah, you allude to that a lot in your latest book with when you spoke with Walt Harrington when he was writing his book on the Craftsman about how you do these dovetails over and over and over again. And it just becomes internalized and it becomes a part of the muscle memory. But then it allows you to reach another level when that stuff becomes automatic. Just that fundamental stuff. I think that's exactly where you're kind of getting at. Through that repetition of the most basic fundamentals, then you're able to reach higher and higher levels of mastery and craft that separates the good from the great.
Yeah, and it begins with really simple things that you don't think of as being part of the art, like something as dumb as comma usage or punctuation. I had a woman in a class some years back, and she was a professional public relations person. And she said, I have a confession to make. All these years, I've never known where commas belong, so I just look at my page and I kind of sprinkle them in like pepper, she said, so that they look sort of where they belong, but I'm never sure. And it caused her tremendous anxiety. Everything she wrote and sent out, she didn't know whether it was correct or whatever. And I sat her down and in 5 minutes said, well, here's some the 5 rules that I use, and they pretty much cover about everything you're going to need. And she said, that's it? That's all? I said, yeah. And once she had those, and that was like doing the dovetails, the commas are automatic. You don't even have to think about it. And then you can think about the stuff you really care about and not whether the comma belongs there. And I think that's a lot of, I always, every day of my life, I thank God for the Catholic nuns I had in grade school. They have diagramming sentences, which is a wonderfully visual way of knowing language and knowing syntax and knowing how you actually craft a sentence and a scene, and just drilling certain things into you. It's like the times tables. You don't have to sit and think, now what is 3 times 3 again? and work it out in your head. You just want to know, because now you can do something else. You know, might be designing a new room in your house or whatever, and you're taking measurements. So you just have to know certain things and practice. You know, all the great guitar solos in history come out of somebody knowing how to do a pentatonic scale, you know, and a minor scale and whatever other scales there are, and they're just mixing up the numbers. So,
you know, you work with a wide spectrum of students, mid-career, early career, pre-career, you know, you name it. And
sure.
And there, on that spectrum, there are a lot of, you know, different goals, I imagine. Some people want, you know, books or magazine, careers, freelance, this, that, and the other. And at some point in there, a writer has to sort of navigate between delusion in oneself and belief in oneself. And how did you approach that line between, and how do you help people through that between, that delusion that you need to push through the dark times, but all like balanced with the belief that you have to keep going and maybe even push through some of it, like those ugly drafts that Hemingway had. Like, he had to have a belief. Sure. But he was at that point deluded. So you have to.
That's a great way of putting it. I always, the first part of that is that you actually have to press people to say, what are your intentions for this? What is your goal? So I say, look, when I do book reviews, you know, so I love reading the books, I love writing the reviews, but I don't want to spend my life editing them and going over the line edits again and again and again. I'll send it in. They can edit it any way they want that preserves the essential dignity of what I'm trying to say. I don't want them to change it, but if they need to cut a paragraph for space, so be it. You know, I've got other things I need to be doing. And I'm doing that because they give me a paycheck, and maybe I like the notoriety of being in a certain publication. If I'm writing a book, you know, that I really love, then I'm doing, that's a work of love. And if I make money, great. If I don't, great. If I'm writing something more commercial, then I want there to be a paycheck attached. I've done lots of script work and other kinds of work. So that's the first thing. Then you're navigating the two things that I think are essential to being a writer of any kind. And one is, you've got to be daring. You've got to have that unshakable belief that, you know what, somebody's going to publish a book someday. It may as well be me. Somebody's going to get into that magazine. It may as well be me. Not that it's easy, but, you know, if you said you wanted to be a dancer or a trombone player in a jazz quartet or a painter or any number of things, people would line up to tell you how impossible that is and all the better ways you could spend your life being a lawyer or something.
Right.
But then you also have to have a kind of humility, because it's the humility that helps you to learn. I can't tell you how many of the people I went to MFA school with who came in really good. I mean, they were already publishing and so forth, but they never really got any better. They never got beyond what they were already doing because they were already pretty good. Some of them were already very good. And they didn't stop and think, well, how do I get better? And I always thought, I suck at this when I started. What the point of view was, and I'm trying to write fiction. And so everybody that could teach me anything, I was all ears. I wanted to know. And so I just had that attitude toward it. But I also had that kind of unshakable conviction that, you know, persistence, being the guy who'll keep on, you know, as I tell my students, you know, you went to the party, but there's writers all over America that stayed in their writing rooms tonight and they're working on their novel. What are you doing? And like, okay, maybe I shouldn't go to that party. At some point, you do have to have a work ethic and a resilience and a way of picking yourself up off the deck. My favorite conversation with John Gardner at Breadloaf in 1982 was the last year he was there before he was killed tragically. We were working together, and he was looking at my stuff, and he goes, I think you've got the soul of a novelist. I think you can do this. And I thought, oh, man, he must be responding to my brilliant ideas and my lovely prose. And he said, no, he said, you've got the mentality of a peasant, you know, who'll go out in the fields every day for 12 hours and just work and work and work. And you also, he says, you look pretty healthy. I think you can stand up to the work. And I thought, well, yeah, talk about kind of demystifying.
Yeah, demystifying, but at the same time, it must have put a lot of gas in your tank to hear that from him at that time.
Yeah, it did. And I always think, too, another kind of paradigm that seems to apply. I met a guy named Jimmy Lai. We were doing a video shoot in Hong Kong years ago when the Brits were handing Hong Kong over to the Chinese. And we met Jimmy Lai, who lived on Victoria Peak, which is maybe the most exclusive address in the world. And he didn't just have an apartment. He had like a compound. He had ostriches walking around and ocelots and, pens or whatever. And the most gorgeous view of Victoria Harbor. He was rumored at that point to be the richest man in Asia. Well, he had come to Hong Kong. I think he was 5 or 6 years old as a refugee from mainland China, an orphan. And I think he either stole or somebody gave him a couple of T-shirts, and he ended up selling them and using the money to buy more. And then he ended up having a T-shirt stand, and then pretty soon he had several. Then pretty soon he had a shop, and then pretty soon he was actually making T-shirts, and pretty soon he had factories in China, which we visited. And I said, what's your business model? Who was your, mentor? Who were you trying to emulate? And he said, I was a kid and I knew nothing, and I knew nothing. And if I set out to be the best, I knew I could never be that. So he said, what I consciously set out to do as a kid was every day learn one thing that I could do the next day better. Mm-hmm. And then the day after that, another thing, and the day after that, another thing. And if I did enough of those days in a row, I would get better at this. And so over the years, he'd gotten really, really a lot better at it. And I think that his satisfaction came not from the money per se, but from being successful in the model of how he ended up doing things. And I always think about that. If you can just get a little bit better, it works in music wonderfully. You can do one thing you couldn't do yesterday, then tomorrow you do one more thing, and pretty soon you look around and say, I'm pretty good at this.
Yeah, a friend of mine who anytime I sort of doubt the utility of social networks, like I met this guy on Twitter, and then I kind of brings me back to it because otherwise I would have never met this guy. His name's Joe Ferrero, and he's a high school teacher, baseball coach, and he has this thing of being 1% better every day. That one little thing, and for me, I get a little notification from dictionary.com on my phone every morning, and it's the word of the day. So I write down that word every day, and that's one little thing. It makes the vocabulary a little better, and you come across cool words you never would ever come across. Or reading a page out of Brian Garner's Modern American Usage, just sharpening that saw just a little bit. I mean, you don't have to tackle the whole thing every day, but if you read a page or something out of it, like you said, that small incremental gain, you get a little bit better. And after 5 years, 10 years, you're going to be pretty damn good if you just do that little bite every day.
Well, sure. Just imagine if you read one short poem every day. That means 365 poems. That means you've written, that's probably 5 books of poetry you would read every year just by reading one short poem a day. Yeah, I think about all that. I also think that it's a great thing for a writer for anybody really, but for a writer in particular, to get out of your comfort zone. And my kind of guiding ethic over the past few years has been I do projects that are interesting. And they're often interesting because it's something that I have never attempted. I remember the first time I was asked to do a video script. I'm like, yeah, that'd be great. Mm-hmm. And then I had to go back to my office and say, what the hell? How do you do that? What's that even about? And I had the entire wrong format and everything, but then I worked my way through it and ended up doing 11, and same thing. I did a radio piece, and it's like, how do you write a radio drama? Nobody even does that anymore. There's not even models out there. And when they called me to do the Civil War series for the magazine, I said, you got me mixed up with somebody. You want me to write about the Civil War for 4 whole years during the sesquicentennial? But I've got friends that are great Civil War historians, and I rattled off a few names, and they said, no, we want somebody who's ignorant, essentially. We want somebody to report something that they know nothing about and find out about it fresh. And I said, well, I'm your guy because I know nothing about the Civil War, except there was one, happened some time back. And so it put me in a position of having to go out and get there was this huge learning curve because the stuff that I found, new and exciting was stuff that anybody who'd actually looked at the Civil War already knew about. So I had to go several levels beyond that and start finding stories that had somehow gotten lost along the way.
Brian Koppelman, who's this screenwriter, wrote Rounders and among other things, the show Billions right now. He has this great quote. It's what unifies every part of my journey is I always lead with my curiosity, obsession, or fascination. And when I was reading and finishing The Art of Creative Research, like that struck me as like this, like that must be what really drives so much of like your work, and like what triggers your need to pursue a story with that sense. And I feel like that compliment quote kind of sums up your approach to a lot of your work.
Yeah, curiosity is just so huge. And I think I'm always completely at a loss when I have students or I meet friends or people who just are not that interested in stuff. And my problem is I'm interested in everything. If I pass a work site and there's a guy using a saw or a jackhammer, I'm like, how do you do that? And I want to sit and watch him for an hour.
Yeah.
And, everybody I see at a freeway rest stop, I want to interview him. Like, where are you going? Where are you coming from? Who's that with? What's up with the dog? And I think it's a good thing, but then you've got to choose among things that you're interested in. And so what I tend to do is I scuffle around in the dirt a bit with new ideas and say, okay, well, that's interesting. And then I think I'm going to start making notes, and I'll do a little soft research. I'll go on the internet and see what's going on, at certain sites with it. And I'll try to make myself drill down, like, why do you care about this? When I did my novel Cape Fear Rising, which is about a racial massacre here in Wilmington, I mean, yes, as a humane individual, I care about racial discrimination and especially a racial massacre. But then the story got more interesting to me when the whole thing was focused around a newspaper editor, a black newspaper editor named Alex Manley. So it was about a writer. And that was interesting, but then it got really interesting when it turned out it was really a kind of a coup d'etat. It was a failure of democracy, an election people didn't like, and they overturned it by force of arms, and nobody was ever called on the carpet about it. And I thought, okay, that's like 3 layers in. Now I've gotten to this thing that has to do with democracy and the rule of law, and I really, really care about that. I think that's where we're seeing a lot of stuff now where that's being challenged. And so once I figured out my story is about the failure of democracy, my story is about people who want to pretend we didn't fight the Civil War and they want to go back to the way it was. And so a lot of it is figuring out why you're interested. And sometimes it takes, writing the whole project till you get there.
Yeah.
Other times it's, no, I'm kind of getting this. I'm writing about music now, and I've always loved music, and I get it, but now I'm forced to sort of come to terms with why. Why does it matter? And it matters for a lot of really good reasons. It matters as a way of connecting. You walk into a room or a campsite or a town hall or, anywhere with a guitar, and all of a sudden you've got 50 friends. And that's interesting. But also the idea that you get to a certain age and everybody's telling you, well, from now on it's downhill. You're going to have health issues. Your best days are behind you. And I don't really want to believe that. I don't want to accept that. And so doing something new and bringing to fruition kind of the dream that a 9-year-old kid had or something, all of a sudden becomes a way of rejuvenating your life and a kind of a different paradigm for viewing what you're going to do from here forward. So, yeah, I think it's figuring out where that passion lies and not just saying, hey, that's really cool. Because pretty much everything's really cool. You look at it.
Yeah, if someone gets interested in everything, which is great because all the ideas are out there and you can never say that there's a thing as writer's block. Like, just look at the world. Yeah. How do you finish things? If you're interested in everything, it's easy to get caught up in a new idea. So how do you tell people, and how do you yourself, who's written so much and so extensively over many genres, how do you finish things before jumping to another project?
It's tough because I generally have several things open at the same time. But I find that's good because there are times when you get to a point where you need a hiatus for something. You need to let something cool on the windowsill for a day or a week or a month before you go back to it. But I've got a very kind of disciplined work ethic, and probably once again, this is Sister Marie Joan and Sister Marie Michael and Sister Marie Bernadette, all the old Franciscan nuns, and they were finish what you start. So part of it, I think, comes in if you choose a project wisely and you do sort of that initial research and pay some attention to why you're doing it, then you know that it will sustain you over the long haul. What you don't want to do is get 40 pages into something. You go, well, now what? What is this? I have no idea where to go next. And so a little bit of, after that initial enthusiasm, to step back a minute before you commit and say, okay, where is this going to come out? What am I looking at? What structure might it have? Even what genre am I going to be working in? So I think you have to do that. And then I'm a great one for putting things on a calendar. I mentioned that book, Cape Fear Rising. I took a year to research it, and I basically wrote on my paper calendar, begin research on a certain day, and end research, start writing novel on another day, and on another day, finish novel. And I pretty much stayed by my calendar so that I could look at it and see whether I was kind of on pace to finish. And a recognition that how you end a thing really goes back to how you began it. What's the promise you made? What's the contract you made with the reader? What is the thing that's finally going? If you promise your reader we're going to take a road trip to L.A., well, L.A. clearly is the ending point. And if you go somewhere else, it better be much more interesting than the L.A. destination that you promised. So I part of it is just good old-fashioned, work ethic and getting things done. And some of it is innately my personality. I as a writer, you have two kind of conflicting things. One is, especially in the long form, you have to be willing to live with a mess.
Yeah.
And it's one reason I like a room to work in, because I like to leave stuff spread out all over the place if I'm working. I don't have to put everything away at the end of the day. I just close the door and it's all here waiting where I left off. But I also like periodically to shelve everything, clean up the office, put paid to that and move on to something else. Mark Twain wrote something one time about the process after he'd finished a novel and about how he'd finish it, take the pages out, and then the maid would come in and tidy up and dust and get rid of all the garbage that had been accumulating, and that was both a really happy day and a really sad day for him. But I find it's both, but it's also the day when you think, okay, now I'm kind of clearing my palate for what comes next. So.
And you write that to be a good writer, you have to be an accomplished daydreamer. And I really love that line because I think it just speaks to the creative spirit and just having, letting your impulses kind of, or letting those dreams sort of guide your vision. And I wonder if you, even from a young age, if you were always a daydreamer and that helped sort of inform the path that you went on as you got older.
Yeah, definitely. Daydreaming is a big part of everything. I can remember one of the things my dad liked to do as a kid was to take us on weekends to visit historic sites. So we'd go to Gettysburg or Fort McHenry or to Valley Forge or the Daniel Boone Homestead or the Amish country. And I remember those long car trips. This back in the day before air-conditioned cars, and so you roll down the window, and I just remember staring out the window for hours as we did these trips and just enjoying it. Just, looking at the farms, who lives there, what's going on, what's the story with that, and kind of making up stories in your head. And to some extent, I still do that. I mean, I guess to a very much extent. I take the dog to the park most mornings, and we run her, and then we take a long walk together along the paths. And I'm not doing anything in particular. I'm just letting my mind wander, just letting whatever thought or image or impression comes into my mind. And often if I find myself stuck in a project, what I want to do is simply go sit out back and stare at the back marsh, take a walk, get on the bike and go, do whatever. And you realize that kind of all the crap gets flushed out of your head. And also new ideas just start to percolate and what ifs start to take shape, and ideas of how to maybe solve a problem just sort of pop up. Like those little screen pop-ups, but you weren't really consciously thinking about it. And I think the advice the nuns always gave us, again, they always said, don't stay up late studying. Close the books at your regular bedtime, whatever the exam is, and get up the next morning and take the exam. You'll be better off. And they're right. The kind of all-nighter. And I guess, again, this has been borne out by scientists studying creativity. Apparently, it's really a bad idea to pull the all-nighter. Apparently, you are better off getting a good night's sleep and tackling it in the morning, partly because you're fresh and partly because your subconscious is actually continuing to work while you're asleep. And so you wake up and suddenly an image or an idea is there that you never would have had otherwise. And you're not going to get it when you're all ragged out with 48 cups of coffee.
Yeah. Well, so much of the growth happens in the dead time. I think you probably noticed this while playing an instrument. It's just you hammer away for however long, and then you feel like you're not getting anywhere. And then the next day or 2 days later, you pick it up and you feel more proficient already, and but what happened? You didn't even pick up the thing in the 12 to 24 hours, and it's starting to come to you. So it's in that dead space where you're passively subconsciously learning while you're letting just on a different level. So you're resting, but you're also something is happening underneath the skin.
Yeah, it's almost like it has to soak into your muscles somehow.
Yeah.
It has to have that time to do it in the same way that if you do a hard workout, it's never the next day you feel bad. It's 2 days later that you feel all the effects of that. And so, I think that's really important. And it's not dead time. I think that, there's a whole lot we don't know about how we learn to do what we learn to do and how the mind works and how the body works. And we don't even know why we sleep. So I guess I have a generalized faith that if it's time to go for a walk or it's time to take a nap, time to put the headphones on and listen to a Gordon Bach, or CD and just kind of let that flow over me, then it's time to do that. And good things will come out of it if I'm patient and I don't press. And it's one of the reasons I love if I'm doing a project where I can actually go somewhere, like we're doing the Civil War project. I went to battlefield after battlefield, the crater up in Petersburg or Gettysburg or the Fort Fisher down here. And for no particular reason, it's not like I'm taking notes on, this particular position or trying to figure out where that regiment was. It's just kind of being there. I remember walking the field of Gettysburg at dawn and, as the mist is sort of smoking up off of the field, and it's just a feeling that infuses you and you start to understand at a very different level stuff that it's not informational in a traditional way. It's informational maybe in a kind of metaphysical or existential or emotional way. And that's just sort of from being there. It's in the air. It's from the effect of, feeling the steps in your feet as you walk Battle Road up by Lexington and Concord, and you realize, how much you're actually climbing hills and coming down hills the whole time. And, all that is really, for me, part of the excitement of research, where you're just opening yourself to the world, saying, okay, let me just let the world flow through me for a while. Let me just pay attention and be really present and just see where that gets me, see what comes up as a result of that.
Yeah, like when you were loading that sort of Revolutionary era musket, and then you put yourself in those shoes of a militia farmer, and then loading this musket is taking a long time, the mule kick in your shoulder, but then picturing this disciplined, uniformed army marching at you. It's just like, whoa, like talk about pressure and facing that. And like you probably couldn't quite have understood that as well as you did until you immersed yourself and put your boots on the ground.
Yeah, it always, in history books, a lot of things look really quaint to us. We look at an old movie with Errol Flynn sword fighting and go, that's really kind of neat, But then you realize that for, 300 years, the sword was what every gentleman carried because there were no police and they were at a moment's notice ready to kill somebody who tried to take their purse away from them or whatever. And in the case of the musket, we were always taught at school, well, these things are sort of unreliable and they couldn't hit much. I'm here to tell you, man, they can hit a lot. And they punch a hole in it the size of your thumb, and then you put the bayonet, and you think, oh yeah, bayonet, it's sort of an abstraction. You see them in these old paintings or whatever, and then you handle one and stick it on, and you think, holy shit, this thing is 18 inches long.
Yeah.
This will go right through me and the next guy behind me. But it does. It makes it real in a way that it just isn't sometimes. When you're looking at books and even the greatest video or audio, it just doesn't bring it home completely. I mean, I still remember climbing up a Jacob's ladder on the side of a ship in the Cape Fear River, and I'd seen those ships for years and years. But having to actually step across that little gap between the rail of the tugboat and the Jacob's ladder, hang on and climb up a couple of decks to get inside while this thing is swinging against this, and the hull was really hot. It's just and then it's vibrating and it's moving fast in the water, and it's really, really big. It's like grabbing a building that's going by. And you're just sort of jerked off. Your arms are hanging on, and your legs are there, and you're dangling. And you never think about a ship again the same way. You just realize these are gigantic, man-made moving objects. They're on a scale that you just can't get from a video.
Yeah, and it's funny it's hard to believe, but like 11 years ago, in a Writer's Chronicle, you wrote a piece, The Art of Creative Research, which I have the hard copy. I've had it all these years, and I subsequently used that as a bookmark when I bought your creative nonfiction book about researching and crafting stories of real life. And now this new book, Art of Creative Research, came out, and it's just like it's great to see this obsession unfolding. And I wonder where your obsession with research comes from? Because you don't write about it this extensively unless it really just kind of gnaws at you and you love it and you just totally just geek out on this stuff. So, so I wonder, where does that come from?
I think I always have had an innate curiosity. So that's part of it. And I always had as my heroes the great explorers of history, the Captain Cooks and the Vasco da Gamas and the Lewis and Clarks and all the people, Joshua Slocum sailing alone around the world. Those guys always excited me. And when I had out of college, I was very lucky to get a job at a very small newspaper, weekly newspaper. And actually, my ignorance, again, I think was helpful. I didn't have any J school training. I hadn't even taken a journalism class. I didn't know the first thing about interviewing. I didn't know about three sources and all that kind of stuff. But I did have colleagues who were pretty good, and they taught me things. But what I really loved was they gave me this magical thing called a press pass. And so if I went to an accident, the police would actually lift up that tape and let me near it. If I went to a show, they would let me backstage. If I went to the rodeo and I cinched Brahma bulls, with the guy, went to the circus and got to perform in it. And I was like, holy cow, this is like my ticket into all that secret world behind the scenes. And I always think a really great nonfiction book in particular, but a novel does it too, probably, lets the reader into the secret backstage world of whatever it is and says, here's some cool stuff, that you don't know. And it's just so cool. You got to come with me and I'll show you. And I always felt like all those people standing out front of the theater didn't get to go back into the dressing room and talk to the star. All those people, who were at the circus for the matinee performance, they didn't get to see the elephants raising the big top at 5 a.m. the way I did, and all that stuff is really, really, to me, exciting. And I think I always tell my wife that my dog has one job in life. It's to make me feel 9 years old. And that's sort of what research does for me when I always have this reaction, how cool is that? Yeah. Before I have a real professional and start saying, well, now let's talk about how you do that and what it means. But I always start with how cool is that? That's kind of the place that gets me going. And so part of it's innate curiosity, and it was getting that early glimpse that you can go behind the scenes, and even without a press pass, mostly if you just ask in a nice way, 9 times out of 10, my experience has been they'll say, okay, come with me, and off you go.
Do you see a lack of rigor among a lot of writers these days, not willing to do this type of footwork and legwork?
We'll put it this way: you can always tell when a writer's doing one or the other. Newspapers, for example, even on a little weekly paper, I was not really ever expected to be in the office except when I was actually writing a story. Nowadays, on a daily newspaper, mid-sized daily, you're probably going to be in the office all day because you're probably going to have to do, 6 or 7 little stories every day. They're going to be telephone quotes. They're not going to be being able to go to a place and do the really in-depth, serious thing you're going to do. I think a lot of people who are writing in various genres and books are relying way too much on the internet, which is a really problematic resource. On the one hand, it's magic. It can tell you things you need to know. It can point you in directions. But boy, you really got to back check those sources, and you got to kind of pull the wiring and see where it leads, because very often it leads to a feedback loop where you basically have something that's wrong. It's just being endlessly repeated and augmented in this sort of, essentially a feedback loop. So I think that's an issue. I actually have probably more trouble with the lack of really good editorial oversight. I read book after book that just has such sloppiness in it. And I think, wasn't anybody paying attention to this? The editor's not serving the writer by, letting some of the stuff get in. And also the editor's not serving the writer by asking questions like, wait a minute, how do you know this? You need to explain this better. Where'd this come from? There's got to be an element of that. And I know one of the surprising things you find out when you write books is that, unlike magazines, book publishers have no fact checkers. They just expect that whatever you're giving them, if you call it nonfiction, until there's a lawsuit or until somebody outs you on a talk show or something, then it must be right. So I think, though, attention to facts and to accuracy and to kind of the real truthfulness of what happened, what somebody said, how it played out in history. Those things have never been more important than they are right now. Have been like for the last 4 weeks.
Yeah.
It's just so crucial to say, actually, it does matter if there was this thing that happened. If there was, no massacre in Bowling Green, that changes everything. It did not happen. You can't then craft national policy on something that's actually a lie. You actually have got, and it also dishonors all those real people who have found themselves the victim of violence of one kind or another. It just wipes that down, and it equates everything to a rhetorical exercise. And people are flesh and blood. They're not rhetorical exercises.
Something I love that your book assumes is that a lot of other people have another job of sorts, whether that's being a student or another, just a full-time job, and then you can kind of write these stories as a side hustle or as something supplementary. Like, you say, like, make sure you get time off from work or have these vacation days, or if you're going to an interesting place, be sure to kind of dig around for stories while you're there anyway. And I wondered, like, how did you come to that in this book as a way of giving people permission to create things, even if it's not their primary vocation, or if it's just another part of who they are. Like, you're not like Tracy Kidder just writing books or something. Like, there are these other facets to your life.
Sure, and part of that comes from watching students over the years do these really remarkable projects and knowing that, some of them are going to make it as writers and want to. Others, they really don't want to. They want to be a biologist or whatever. But in the meantime, they really have this cool essay they want to write about, conifers or something. And so you have to, again, judge what their intentions are. But you're realizing that any profession that is outside the mainstream, that has to do with the arts, that has to do with anything daring or unusual, takes a while to get your legs under you, unless you're very, very lucky and right out of the box, you hit a home run. But typically, even when it looks like people are overnight sensation, you don't see all the groundwork that they've done over the years to get there. So part of it is a recognition that you may be starting on something that may take you a while to get to. But I've worked so much over the years with architects and doctors and lawyers and people who are working in, for public service in the State Department realm or something. And they do have day jobs and they love their day jobs, but they also have a well of expertise that comes from their day job. So Paul Austin, who I work with, is a wonderful writer. He's also an emergency room surgeon, doctor. And he's not going to stop being a doctor because he loves it, but he's also really keen to write stories about what it means to be a doctor. And I think in many ways, those kinds of writers, to me, are the most interesting because they bring something to the work that is a whole separate expertise than just writing. And I say just writing is a whole expertise on its own, but it does bring something to the party that makes them a very interesting mind to spend time with.
And you spend a lot of time in the book talking about the art of the interview and cultivating that experience. And I wonder, did you spend a lot of time there because you noticed a weakness among a lot of people that you want to see strengthen? And maybe as a sort of a follow-up to that too, was that something that you saw as a weakness in your own research and reporting that you were looking to hone over the course of hundreds upon hundreds of these interactions?
Yeah, I mean, my wife Jill would laugh whenever I say this, but I'm essentially an introvert. Mm-hmm. I remember being a reporter, and the thing I hated the most, always, and I still hate it, is making a cold call. Dialing the number of some stranger who you want to talk to, and when they pick up the other end of the line, you have about 10 seconds to figure out how to make yourself appear to them as someone they want to talk to, so that they'll stay on the line. And it always felt to me like calling up girls in high school, and like their father answers. It's like there's never a good outcome.
Yeah.
So part of it is that you, at some point, you just have to knock on that closed door. You have to call that person up. I think it's much easier now when you can actually tickle somebody with an email or a Facebook message or something and just say, hey, you don't know me, but I'd love to talk to you, because that can set the stage for a kind of a soft entry into something, and they can get back to you at their leisure, and then you can set up a time. And that's a little easier than just the cold call. But sometimes you just have to go to a place and walk into a room or knock on a door or go into an office and say, hi, I'm here to talk to Mr. Smith or Mrs. Jones, and they don't know I'm coming, but I'd love to speak to them if they're here. So part of it is that I think it's a hard thing to do for many of us, and therefore you need to recognize right up front that it's a really important thing to learn how to do. Because when you think about it, what's happening is these people are all your teachers. They know stuff, often very interesting stuff, often stuff that only they know because it's private or personal or because they have a specialized expertise. And they are going to teach you what they know. They're going to tell you about it. So it's useful for that. It's also, I think, really important that we learn how to have conversations again. I love being in a room with smart people, whether it's a classroom or around a dinner table or, my favorite bar, and where people are talking about ideas and they're sharing work and they're, talking about a play or a movie they've seen, or they're talking politics, but not just us against them. They're talking about political nuance, mixing in history and what have you. And I think as a culture, and maybe the internet age has hastened this, but it feels like we often don't know how to have conversations. And so learning how to interview is essentially learning how to have a conversation, which begins with, respecting the person you're talking to. You're not there to judge them. And I think in human interaction, that's really hard to do. I remember sitting with an old moonshiner who was the best cursor I ever met in my whole life. And he wouldn't let me record him, so most of it is so idiomatic I've lost it. But he was also fiercely racist. He was, Obama, oh God, the stuff he said about Obama and Hillary and the rest. And yet I wasn't there to talk to him about that. I was there to talk to him about how you made good corn whiskey, which he really knew how to do. And I tasted some of his corn whiskey, so I know. And he was funny. He told jokes. And so, even though he's not the kind of guy that I would typically hang out with and maybe count among my intimate friends, I'm really glad I met him. I'll probably see him again. He invited me back to make a batch of moonshine. And the interviewer has to say, I'm not judging you. We're talking. I want you to have your complete say, and I'll push you to explain what you are saying, and I'll maybe goad you a little bit. Maybe I'll ask you questions that are difficult to answer. Maybe I'll just let you talk and tell your story. But I'm going to hear it first before I do anything else. I'm not going to shut you down and judge you. And I think that is a huge lesson, kind of a life lesson for our civics lesson here. But I think every writer has to figure that out, because you won't learn if you're constantly judging it through a narrow lens. And you may be right to judge. I mean, as a human being, you might be right to say that person is sexist or racist or that person is crude or what have you. But that's got no place in what you're doing in the interview, which doesn't mean, by the way, that you can't call them on certain things and ask them about it. When you say this, some people would hear that as racist. What do you say to them? You can push. You don't have to just sort of be namby-pamby about it. But you do have to learn how to have a difficult, sometimes enlightening conversation with a person. And I think that is a skill that requires a lifetime. And I still think about the interviews that didn't go well, the ones that went great, how to do it better next time. And each time I go into a room, I always feel that kind of flutter of anticipation, that little bit of anxiety. Same as I feel, by the way, walking into a classroom, especially at the beginning of the semester. And I always felt that if I didn't feel that little flutter anymore, I'd probably have to stop doing it.
That flutter and that sense of nerves is something I feel before I speak to anybody, and it doesn't matter who they are, or even how long I've known them. And there's an instance in your book. Was it the artist? Was it Ellsworth Kelly? Am I getting that right?
Ellsworth Kelly, yeah. Wonderful. He's passed away recently.
Yeah. And you were parked in your car outside on the curb for 15 minutes because you were nervous about approaching him and talking to him about this. And you write about that in the book. And how do you dance with that fear and dance with those nerves? And overcome it and use it and just kind of how do you deal with that? Because that's something I think a lot of people wrestle with.
Well, it helps to set up a habit or a routine and say every time I do an interview, here's what I do, here's how I prepare, here's what I wear, and here's the first thing I say, here's the last thing I say, and to create a framework for yourself. I mean, with the newspaper, the great advantage of that was to say, I'm here from the Weekly Post. And people say, okay, you're not Philip, you're this guy, you're a reporter, and I'm really talking to the newspaper. So if you have an institutional affiliation, that kind of breaks that ice. So instead of that, I sort of decide, when I go to interview somebody, I'm not Philip Gerard. I'm like Philip Gerard Incorporated. I'm working for the project. How every movie creates its own corporation. So this is for the project, Secret Soldiers Incorporated or whatever. Mm-hmm. And then I have a certain set of things I do in the same way that I come in and close the door and start writing, and I'm writing during the day. If I'm interviewing, I change all my batteries if I'm going to record anything. I make sure I've got fresh notebooks. I take more pens than I'll ever need because if one of them, runs out of ink, breaks, if I have to give it to somebody along the way or give it to my interview subject or whatever, I want to have an extra pen to pull out of my pocket. I do dumb things like that are kind of like getting suited up for the game, if you will, putting your pads on or whatever. And again, I think of the first thing I'm going to say. I say when I walk in, what am I going to say? And typically it's easy. It's like, hi, so glad you could see me. It's very gracious of you to make time or whatever. It's just some kind of polite thing. And sometimes it's not, sometimes it's different, but I always sort of know, I kind of envision when I get there what it's going to be like. And often it's not. Often the people that you're most intimidated by turn out to be the easiest people. Bill Blass, I think I wrote about in the book, so famous, so guarded by so many layers of people who are there to insulate him from people that want things from him, which is, thousands of people in those days. And walking in and finding the most gracious, easygoing guy in the world and sitting down and feeling like, he was the uncle I'd known for 25 years. And, so there's that. But then I think you fall back on your training. The naval aviators have it right. They say you don't rise to the occasion. You think you will, but you won't. What you'll do is default to the level of your training. Mm-hmm. And so I say, okay, I've done this before. What did I do right and wrong? Okay, let's make sure I do that right this time. And here's how it usually works. And then I do another exercise. I always think, what's the worst that can happen? If this turns out to be a total fiasco, what will that look like? They'll throw you out. They'll throw a drink in your face. They'll scream at you. I haven't had all those done, but I've had people scream at me. I've had people shut the door in my face, slam it. In fact, but if you're envisioning it ahead of time, then when it happens, you go, "Well, that happened." And that was on the menu, so what's plan B? And then you move on. And it doesn't happen that much. Typically, you get a qualified success of some kind, and especially if you always say, hey, when I get home and look at my notes, I know I'm going to have done some dumb thing and left something out. Can I call you or email you or text you, or how would you prefer I get in touch with you? And most people say, oh, yeah, sure, here's my number or whatever. But don't call me on Tuesday, I'll be away, but on Wednesday I'll be back. Or, they'll have their own thing. But it does leave the door open and takes the pressure off, so you get home and realize, oh, my God, I forgot to ask that crucial fact. Yeah. How do I call them again and explain that? Well, they're ready for your call. They're not surprised when you call. Like, oh, well, hey, good to see you again. What's going on? And you say, just one thing I wanted to clarify. And then it becomes a really easy kind of conversation. So, again, it's those little tricks that just trick you into having the courage to do what you want to do. I mean, you really do want to talk to them. And usually 3 minutes into any interview, I'm loving it. I'm having a great time. We're laughing and talking and sharing and all the rest of it. But, that knock on the door, that first phone call, that, first moment when you see them, that kind of, you got to get past that. And you got to remind yourself that in the past, you did get past that. My mother taught me a trick when I was a teenager, and I'd be going through, one trial after another. And she sat me down one day and she said, okay, what you have to do is imagine this is over and you're looking back on it. You failed that exam, or that girl dumped you, or you lost the big game, or whatever it was. Or maybe you won the big game. What's it going to mean to you? How do you feel about it? And what are you doing in your life at the moment you're looking back on it? And it really helped me get perspective on a lot of things. So that if you're in a really bad moment, you think, well, okay, tomorrow morning I'll be doing something different. I'll be over here with this other person, and it'll all be okay. Eventually we'll get where we're hiking, and there'll be a shelter and a campfire, and I'll get warm and have a meal, whatever the case may be. And interviews are like that. If you're in excruciating silence and it's like pulling teeth, and, you're pitching every kind of subject idea you can imagine, and all you're getting is, yeah, no, maybe. Part of you goes out of your body for a minute and goes, well, waiting at home for me is a bottle of single malt scotch and a beautiful wife and a dog, and my kid. So that's where I'm going. I'm done here.
And with recording, a lot of people are, I think, they're kind of polarized on voice recorders, digital recorders, tape recorders. I know, John McPhee has been notoriously against them his whole career because he thinks they distort. But I kind of see them as a catch-all and a guard against bad penmanship, especially with me. That's for sure. Yeah. And you defend them with rigor in the book. And I wonder just how did you come to that? And have you wrestled with that in the past, like wanting to be like Tom French, who just uses Greg's shorthand, or just your own shorthand or whatever? Like, how did you come to using and defending the recorder? And I'll say I'm on board with it because I just know myself and I know I need it. And I wonder how you came to that.
Well, I'll say about Tom French, he's a terrific interviewer, and I know that his shorthand is really accurate because I've seen him do an interview and then heard him read back the transcript from his notes. Yeah. But he came to terms with that because he really was after accuracy, and his interviews tend to be pretty dynamic, pretty much in motion, where he's hanging around the zoo all day and you can't keep a tape recorder going for 10 hours a day for how many months he was there. I think it's important I think accuracy is really important. And I think one of the problems is one of the first places where those little tricky fictional things enter the work, if you're doing nonfiction, is you hear the quote the way you wanted to hear it. It's a little bit more dressed up. It's a little bit cooler. And it's not like you're saying to yourself, I'm going to falsify this or distort it, but you do have a tendency. In the same way when we come home and, tell our husband, wife, partner, what went on today. I was at the motor vehicle. You wouldn't believe what this guy said. Well, it's not accurate when you're reporting what that guy said. You're reporting how you heard what he said.
And if there are like potholes in that street of what you were hearing, you tend to fill it in with the tar of your own vocabulary.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I will say, when I hear that argument, and John McPhee is old school, and I have a feeling if you came of age when tape recorders were very clunky things that weighed 5 pounds and they were the elephant in the room, and he did a lot of dynamic work, looking for a ship or being in a birch bark canoe or whatever, I think it probably was extremely difficult. Also, when you're doing immersion work where you're with somebody day after day for months on end, I think it's very hard to just sort of grab a tape recorder and say, well, today we're recording, although there may be a place where you work that in for a more formal kind of interview about certain things. Yeah. But I think often when I hear writers say, well, I don't interview, it kind of distorts the process. Sometimes what I'm hearing is they're kind of too lazy to do it. Yeah. They just don't want transcription. And I get it. Transcription is just one of the most thankless things until it's not. Until at the moment, I remember transcribing this veteran I interviewed, and we were at a coffee shop, which was not my first choice, but we were down at the Holiday Inn outside of Miami, and all of a sudden in the kitchen they were doing some work, and you hear like some kind of a tool, and he literally dove under the booth. Oof. And I hear this on the tape, and I'm remembering, yes, and then he launches into a story about being on the line during the Battle of the Bulge, and the way the Germans used to use the tracer bullets to get GIs to stick their heads up, and then the next machine gun would go low and saw them off. And it was a really big emotional moment in the transcript. And I was able to say, oh, wow, not only did I get him, but I got this noise in the background, which was the trigger for it. And it really helped me understand it. And then there are other times, if you just write down in your notes something, you don't get the context. I always show my students a clip from that movie of My Cousin Vinny. I don't know if you know it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where what's his name? Ralph Macchio is in the police station, and the guy's saying, and then you killed the clerk. And he goes, I shot the clerk. I shot the clerk. And they read it back in quarters. I shot the clerk. I shot the clerk. And it's what's missing is you don't have the tape recording of it. And the audio is everything because it tells you, was somebody being ironic? Were they being funny? Were they being serious? Were they being earnest? Were they lying to you? You can pick all that up in the tone. And by the way, you'll hear all those things you didn't hear. You'll hear the bird song in the background. You hear the waitress, calling an order, and you'll hear somebody else at the next table talking about their marriage breakup or something. All these things that may or may not be part of your project. If you're a novelist, they may fit in beautifully. If you're working on nonfiction, maybe or maybe not. But they do give you a much more three-dimensional picture than just the scribbles in your notebook. So and I don't always use it. Sometimes people will not let me use it, but when I can, I try to.
Yeah, I think I read an interview with John Krakauer. It's in the New Journalism by Boynton. I think he views it like why you have your recorder, but think of all these tools like a photographer having different lenses. It's just another aspect that you can use. Like using a recorder, it doesn't make sense a lot of the time. But for instance, like when I was like following a horse trainer around a shed row for like an hour as he's cooling out a horse, it's like it helped to have a recorder and just following him around as he's talking and talking and talking. But you can't be writing everything down. So it's kind of like that. You want to have it there in case you need it, and it's just why not have every tool in your Batman utility belt?
Exactly, and it means that if the tape recorder is running, then you don't necessarily have to take notes over all that. You can be looking around and kind of thinking about other things and taking notes about what they look like, the ambiance of the place, something else happening in the background, all the things that are going to be invisible if all you're doing is scribbling down kind of a transcript of what they say. So yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it. I try to make that clear in the book that there are tools, and every job is going to require a different tool belt. Sometimes you're going to need a camera. Now we have smartphones. They've got pretty much everything built into them. So why not use what's built into them? You already have a camera. Instead of writing down the historical mark, we'll just take a picture of it,
Yeah.
Do the things that help you. And always imagine that later on, especially on a long project, it might be 6 months before you open that interview again, or look at those photographs or those notes on the place, because in the meantime, you've been busy out in the field doing other things. And at that point, you're going to think, oh man, boy, I wish my memory were just so much better than it is. And it's like our driving. We all think we're better drivers than we are. Well, we sure all think our memories are so much better than they are.
Yeah.
And our memories are like, come on, they're really not that reliable. They're really reliable when you're in an emotional situation, usually for the first time. You're going to get the best, most serious impression. But, if you interview 20 different people, it's hard keeping straight who said what in your memory. That's why you have notebooks and tape recorders and photographs and the rest of it.
I was having just a couple more things, and I'll let you get going, Philip, because you're being very, very generous with your time.
Oh, I'm enjoying this.
I appreciate it. Great. I am too. It's been a boatload of fun. And I was speaking with a former ballerina a few months ago, and I was like, I'm sort of obsessed with people who have like this singular focus on a craft, and ballerinas are so singularly devoted. Bodybuilders too. Like I'm kind of obsessed with those people who have this monkish devotion. And I was talking to her because so many of them, there are so many dancers, and like, how do you stand out? How do you make it? And she said the ones who make it they know who they are as an artist. He's like, it's hard to define, but they know who they are, and they lean into those strengths, and those are the ones that tend to make it. And I was just so taken with that. And I wonder, like, how did you as an artist, like, come to your, like, how did you learn to know who you were and then sort of lean into those strengths and develop as the artist and writer that you have become after, years and years of that practice?
I think that's a great question. I love that quote. I think that knowing who you are is probably why great lawyers are great lawyers, and great, architects are great architects. That is, they put aside all the other things, the expectations of other people and the conventional ways of kind of getting approval, and they really know in their own mind when they will have succeeded. I think for me it was incremental. It was the first part of that was learning, as I said, I like to be the guy going behind the scenes. Okay, that's interesting. I didn't know that about myself. I just wrote a piece about being on the road when I was a kid in college. I would go on the road every summer, just take a few $100s, stuff it in my pocket against emergencies, and a backpack and a guitar and hitchhike around the country. And I wrote about how that really taught me a lot about who I was. It taught me that I could be patient, but I wasn't. So I had to cultivate patience, because there was a lot of waiting time. Mm. It taught me that I had a quick temper, and that was not going to get me anywhere with anybody, and I better get rid of that fast. I learned that I could put up with a lot of hardship. I didn't mind being really hot. I didn't mind baking in the sun and, being rained on and all the rest of it. I could take that. I was in pretty good shape. I had stamina. I didn't mind if I went a day without food, as long as I had water. So I started to learn what my strengths were physically, emotionally, mentally, intellectually, whatever. I figured out who the people were that I most liked to be around, who I trusted, because I didn't trust people innately. But once I trusted them all the way. So I started kind of figuring out and maybe getting this thing that you don't even know till you have it, which is a kind of a confidence that you can go into a room full of strangers and you're going to be who you are. You're just not going to take on the coloration of the room, which most people do, frankly. I think they join a profession, they join a group, they join whatever, and they want to blend in. It's the most human thing in the world. But you can blend in, but also remain who you are. So that's part of it. Learning as a writer, then, what I wanted to do. And one of the things I wanted to do very early on was write books. And so I said, well, I want to go somewhere where I can learn to do that, because I thought the book was the kind of big thing, was the way my mind worked. It was the one place that was big enough where I could go in a lot of different directions and bring it all back, kind of organize it, but it wouldn't just be a short take and then out. And again, I think who you are, maybe, I don't know if it changes, but it certainly sharpens as you get older and you start figuring out what you're interested in. And I long ago figured out I was very interested in writing about community. Whether it's in novels, nonfiction, what have you, the community of soldiers together in the war, the community on Hatteras Island in that novel, the community here in Wilmington disrupted by the racial violence. And I think part of the reason that I figured that out was at one point, and I do this periodically now, I lay my work out literally on a table and say, what am I writing about? And how is it connected? And I just do a little kind of thought experiment, and I say, oh, I guess I didn't realize I'm so focused on this. Looks like I'm obsessed, in fact, with this idea. I've always been very, very interested in the nature of heroism, especially when it's ordinary people you don't expect to do something extraordinary in a moment of crisis. I wrote about two boys who were shipwrecked on a sailboat going into Charleston Harbor in the middle of the night, swam from the jetty into Sullivan's Island, were found at 11 o'clock the next morning, having been in the water for, I think at that point, almost 12 hours, and they were still alive. They were just dying as they were found. Mm-hmm. And the coroner decided those boys could not have been in the water for 11 or 12 hours. They must have made the island, rested, and then gone back into the water, searching for the one boy's father and the other boy's brother. And I thought, if that's the case, and I wrote about this, what amazing heroism in the middle of the night for two boys. Nobody would ever know the difference if they didn't do this. But if they, in fact, did that, which is what the coroner suggested that must have happened, then you got something that's extraordinary that goes to probably the biggest obsession I have, which is the mystery of human personality. Who people are, why they do the things that they do, and how do you get to the bottom of a personality. We're all so many different people during the course of the day. My students see me as a teacher, to my wife, I'm a husband, to my dog, I'm the guy that gives the treats and takes it in the car, and different people see you as different things. So how do you maintain an integrity, and what's the key to doing that? So those are some of the things that I became obsessed with. And of course, one of the byproducts of having to figure out why you're writing about the things you're writing about is to say, well, who does that make me if that's what I care about? Who does that make me if I'm looking in the window seeing me watching this movie or reading that book or doing this hobby or whatever it is? What judgment would I make about myself and about my priorities and about my character and all the rest of it? And so you're constantly kind of moving to the outside, and not constantly, but every so often you're moving from the outside and looking in. I always tell my students, go to a place outside of your own house or apartment or whatever and look at it from a different perspective. If your neighbor lets you go up into their second floor and look over into your backyard, or go across the street and look at your apartment house and your lighted window. And, imagine what people are seeing when they're seeing you. And if that's who you want to be, great. But if it's not who you want to be, then maybe you have to think about who you want to be and how to get there. And all of that's mixed up in what you write, how you write about it, how well you write about it.
And what would you say is the biggest takeaway you want readers and writers, whether they be poets, novelists, or nonfiction writers, what do you want them to take away from this book?
I guess at the most basic level, what I would like is for somebody to read that book and say, well, I'm going to do it, and just go out, interview somebody, go out to a place they haven't been before and write about it, go out and take notes watching someone do something interesting, just something that puts them out in the world, paying attention the way a writer pays attention, and gives them that kind of the relief from the endless introspection. You know, it's what when I teach research class here, basically what I do is I send all my students into the field. They have assignments, and then they come and report back what they found and share their ideas and their methods. And then they go out again and do some more. And that's what I want. Okay, get out of the office, get out of the classroom, go out there into the world, wherever the world is, and do something you haven't done before. Talk to somebody you haven't met before. Go to a place you haven't seen before and experience it and really be present for it.
And you don't have to go far to get out of your own head. I think a lot of people think you might have to go to some exotic place, but geez, you could call them backyard narratives, because there are so many stories that are quite literally in your backyard.
Oh yeah, I think that's really important, and it also takes away an excuse. Those people that say, "Well, I'd love to do a story, but I can't afford to do what John Krakauer do and go to Nepal and climb a mountain, so I guess I can't." Yeah, but you can. I can go out in my backyard right now, and 50 feet from the house, there's a great white heron stilting in the marsh. There's a great blue heron, rather. There's white ibis. There's a great horned owl that I heard last night across the way. So I could do a gigantic bird story without ever going off my front porch or back porch. There's every ecological story in the world is contained in the salt marsh that backs up to my house, that has to do with everything from what the Army Corps is doing, which takes you to the connection with the Army Corps in, South Dakota and whatever. It's all here. All the threads come right back to your door, and you just have to decide how far down that thread you want to go. But it takes away the excuse. There's, literally in your backyard, literally on your front porch, down the street at the local coffee shop, wherever it is, there's something interesting that's worth a story. And the fault is with you, not with the world, if you can't find it.
Yeah, I've got, it's fine. I was gonna end there, but I have one more. I can't let you get away with. It's because you were talking about the sequential nature of one door opens another, each domino knocks over another one, and you write about this too. It's really easy to get bogged down in the research, and there's kind of productive procrastination in that, because you can just keep leaning into finding more information. At what point do you say, like, enough's enough, it's time to get writing and start powering through this? You've done the work, now it's time to do the next level of work.
Yeah, I always think of it like a steeplechase. All these riders are out in the woods, they've been chasing whatever all day, and then they're racing home. And the way they're doing it is by looking at the church steeple, which is the only thing they can see sticking up out of the village. And so they're racing toward it, and they're all taking a different path. They're going over hedges and through water and what have you. But if you can't look up and see the steeple, then you're sunk. And so every so often in my work, I try to look up and see the steeple and find out, okay, I went down this path. It's really cool and interesting, and I've spent 5 days on it. What's it got to do? Where's the steeple? Can I see it from here? So periodically I check that. And then there's a point, I'm a firm believer in setting deadlines for yourself. And so when I put down on my calendar, start writing the novel, start writing the book, that means your research clock just ran out. Now, that doesn't mean you're not going to maybe go back and do some supplemental research if you can, but really, your budget just ran out for that. Now you're off the clock. If you do it, it's on you. Now you're supposed to be writing. So that's another way to do it. And then I think there is a point at which it comes to me in various ways at different projects. I'm thinking John Steinbeck always used to say that, the journey, you set a journey out. The journey might be to go to California and back, but at a certain point, the journey's over, and you know it. And if you continue on your preset, itinerary, you're just going through the motions. And I think there's a point at which I almost feel like a sprung. I'm thinking the journey's over. I'm the research journey, which is a drama, which usually leads to some kind of climactic discoveries and things that just blow your mind, and then propels you to the next phase. there's a moment when you think, this is done. For me, it was with Secret Soldiers riding back in the car from Florida and suddenly just being overwhelmed with this emotion that I wasn't going to see these guys again. I'd written about guys that were, the youngest was 74, the oldest was 96, I think, at that point. And I thought, I'm never going to see these guys again. And then I said, the other part of that was, well, I better go home and start writing then, because I want them to see this before they die. And in fact, as soon as the book came out, virtually within weeks, I started getting one card and phone call after another from widows and sons and daughters saying, so-and-so has passed away, but he got to read your book. And it was almost like many of them were waiting for somebody to know their story. So I always think there's a clock on a book. There's commercially somebody else might do it before you, but really more important is you've kind of got to where you really know it. It's time to write it. Stop fussing around. When you find yourself like endlessly sharpening your pencils and, rearranging the stuff on your desk and time to dust that bookshelf. No, it's not. It's time to sit down.
Awesome. Well, Philip, thank you so much for carving out some time to talk shop. This was a whole lot of fun.
This has been great. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much, Brendan.
You're welcome. We'll be in touch. Take care, Philip.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Hey, what's this? An outro? Yeah, that's right. Thanks for listening, everybody. If you made it this far, all I ask for you is to share the episode, subscribe on iTunes or Google Play Music, like the hashtag CNF podcast page, and follow me on Twitter. That's actually a lot of stuff, and if you could do a quarter of it, I'd be happy. But also, do you know someone who wants to be on the show? You got a good guest idea? Do you want to be on the show if you're a writer of nonfiction? Just email me. Also, since you made it this far, I'm happy to give you a free editing consult. Just email me. I didn't tease that out on purpose. It's that simple. And lastly, a quote from my favorite all-time movie. Stay cool. Stay cool forever.